The dirt had barely settled over the coffin when the whispers started, and by sundown half of Larkspur Creek was convinced that Timothy Wells had finally lost his mind. It was the spring of 1878, in the rolling grasslands of Wyoming Territory, where the wind carried the scent of sage and the promise of rain that rarely came. The town of Larkspur Creek sat along a shallow bend of the Sweetwater tributary, a cluster of clapboard buildings and false-fronted stores that had grown up around a stagecoach stop a decade before. It was not a large town, but it was proud, and it did not take kindly to a man burying his enemy with a folded flag and a rifle salute, as though the outlaw had been a hero, instead of the very devil who had terrorized half the county. Hazel Hadley stood at the edge of the crowd that day, her gloved hands clasped in front of her gray mourning dress, watching Timothy Wells kneel beside the grave and press his palm flat against the raw earth. She was the only one there who was not whispering. She understood, or at least she was trying to understand, and that understanding had not come easily. It had come from 3 months of knowing the man, of watching him carry a grief that ran deeper than anyone in town suspected, and of falling in love with him despite every reason the town could give her not to. But to understand why Timothy Wells knelt at that grave with his hat in his hands, one had to go back to the day Hazel Hadley first came to Larkspur Creek, riding on the back of a hired wagon with a broken trunk latch and a heart full of quiet determination. It was early March when the stagecoach line dropped her at the edge of town, for the regular route did not run all the way in during mud season. She had come from Independence, Missouri, where her father had passed the winter before, leaving her the modest sum of his savings and no reason to stay in a house that echoed with his absence. She was 26 years old, unmarried, with auburn hair she wore pinned beneath a plain straw bonnet and a spine made of something sturdier than most folks gave a schoolteacher credit for. She had written ahead to the town council of Larkspur Creek, having heard through a cousin that they were desperate for someone to run the new schoolhouse, and they had written back within the month, practically begging her to come. She had not expected to be stranded a mile outside of town when the wagon wheel cracked on a rut hidden beneath melting snow. The driver, an old man named Prout who hauled freight between towns, had cursed under his breath and set to examining the damage while Hazel stood shivering in the wind, her trunk half tumbled into the mud. It was there, on that lonely stretch of road, that she first saw Timothy Wells riding toward them on a bay gelding, a coil of rope at his saddle and a rifle slung across his back, looking every bit like the sort of man dime novels back east liked to write about, though he would have scoffed at the comparison. "Trouble," he called out, reining in beside the wagon. "The wheels cracked clean through," Prout said. "I got no spare axle, and this lady's got to get to town before nightfall." Timothy Wells dismounted without hurry, the kind of unhurried movement that spoke of a man who had spent years learning that panic solved nothing. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with a weathered face that might have belonged to a man 10 years older than his actual 31, and dark eyes that studied the broken wheel with the same careful attention he seemed to give everything. "I can rig something to get you rolling slow," he said, "or you can ride into town on my horse, ma'am, and I'll see to the wagon after." Hazel had looked at the stranger, at his patched coat and his calloused hands, and made a decision that surprised her with its swiftness. "I would be grateful for the ride if it is no trouble to you." "No trouble," he said, and there was the faintest curve at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but close enough to it that she felt something ease in her chest. He helped her up onto the gelding first, then swung up behind her with an ease that told her he had done such things before, and they rode the last mile into Larkspur Creek with the wind picking up and the sky threatening snow that never came. She remembered later how steady his arm had felt around her waist, how he had not said much beyond pointing out the schoolhouse roof when it came into view, and how she had felt, for the first time since her father's funeral, that she was not entirely alone in the world. "You are the new schoolteacher, then," he said as they neared the edge of town. "I am Hazel Hadley, Timothy Wells, he said. I run cattle on the section west of town near the creek bend. Thank you, Mr. Wells, for your kindness. Wasn't kindness, he said, though his tone did not match the words. Wasn't right to leave a lady stranded on the road. She had laughed then, a small surprised sound, and he had glanced back at her with something like curiosity, as though he had not expected her laughter and did not quite know what to make of it. That was the beginning, though neither of them called it that at the time. Larkspur Creek welcomed her with the kind of practical warmth that frontier towns reserved for anyone useful. The council had scraped together enough lumber to build a proper one-room schoolhouse the previous autumn, and Hazel found herself teaching 23 children ranging from 6 years old to 16, in a room that smelled of fresh pine and chalk dust. She boarded with the widow Simmons, who ran the boarding house near the Mercantile, and within 2 weeks she had learned the names of most every family in town, along with a fair share of their business, for there were few secrets kept long in a town of 600 souls. She learned, too, about Timothy Wells, though the information came slowly and in pieces, the way most true things did in a place where gossip traveled faster than fact. He had come to Wyoming territory 8 years before, after the war, buying up grazing land cheap because no one else wanted it, land too far from water for most ranchers' liking. He had built his herd slow and careful, and now ran near 400 head of cattle with the help of 2 hired hands, a Mexican vaquero named Rafael Ortiz, and a young man named Bill Cody who had come west after losing his family to fever in Kansas. Timothy Wells was respected in town, if not exactly warm with people, a man who kept to himself except when duty called him otherwise, which it often did, for he had once ridden as a scout for the Union Army during the war and folks still came to him when trouble needed tracking. What Hazel did not learn until later, and what few in town spoke of openly, was the reason behind the shadow that sometimes crossed his face when certain topics arose. That reason had a name, and the name was Silas Crane. The two of them crossed paths again at the Sunday social held at the church 3 weeks after her arrival, an event meant to raise funds for a new well, and to give the town's unmarried folk a chance to look each other over without seeming too eager about it. Hazel had been standing near the refreshment table, balancing a plate of biscuits and trying to remember the name of the freckled boy tugging at her skirt, when Timothy Wells appeared beside her with 2 cups of lemonade. "You looked like you could use a rescue," he said, handing her one. "I am beginning to think, Mr. Wells, that rescuing me is becoming something of a habit for you." "Only the second time," he said. "Wouldn't call that a habit yet." "Give it time," she said, and there it was again, that almost smile, the one that seemed to cost him something to produce but that he gave anyway. They talked for the better part of an hour that evening, about her students, about his cattle, about the mountains that rose blue and distant to the west, and how neither of them had ever climbed them despite having lived in their shadow. He asked about her father, and she found herself telling him more than she had told anyone since arriving in town, about the quiet man who had raised her alone after her mother died birthing her, about the small dry goods store he had run in Independence, about how she had promised him on his deathbed that she would not spend her life afraid of the world simply because he was no longer in it to protect her. "That is a hard promise to keep," Timothy said. "It is," she agreed. "But I intend to keep it all the same." He looked at her then with an expression she could not quite name, something between admiration and recognition, as though she had said something that touched a nerve he rarely let anyone near. "My brother made me promise something similar once," he said, "before he died. I am sorry. It was a long time ago. That does not always make it hurt less." He had looked at her sharply then, surprised, she thought, that she understood that much without needing it explained. "No," he said quietly. "It does not." She did not press him further that night, sensing the boundary of a wound not yet ready to be examined, but she carried the exchange with her long after the social ended, turning it over in her mind the way one turns over a stone found on a river bank, wondering what lay beneath it. The full story of Timothy Wells's brother and of Silas Crane came to her in fragments over the following weeks, first from the widow Simmons, who liked to talk while she kneaded bread dough, and later from Timothy himself, on an evening when the wind was still and the stars had come out thick and close over the prairie. During the war, when Timothy was barely 19 and his younger brother Elias only 16, their family had worked a modest farm along the Missouri border, in country torn apart by raiders who cared little for uniforms and much for plunder. Silas Crane had ridden with one such band, men who called themselves partisan rangers but who were, by most honest accounts, little better than bandits using the war as cover for their crimes. In the autumn of 1864, Crane's band had descended on the Wells farm looking for horses and grain, and in the chaos that followed, young Elias, trying to defend the family's last mare, had been shot down in the yard. Timothy had been away at the time, riding dispatch for a Union cavalry unit, and had returned 3 days later to find his brother buried in a shallow grave dug by neighbors too frightened to linger, and his mother gone half mad with grief, and his father unable to look at him without seeing the son who had lived while the other had died. He had spent the remaining months of the war hunting for Crane's band, with a fury that his commanding officers mistook for zeal, and that Timothy himself understood, even then, as something closer to a slow poisoning of the soul. He had never caught Crane, not in all those years, though he had heard the name whispered in a dozen towns since, always attached to some new outrage, a robbed bank here, a burned homestead there, as the man drifted west ahead of the law and the war's end, never quite outrunning either. "I thought I was done with it," Timothy told Hazel that evening, sitting on the porch of the boarding house where propriety allowed them to talk, though the widow Simmons kept half an eye on them through the window all the same. "Thought I'd buried it along with Elias. But then I heard 3 weeks back that a man matching Crane's description had been seen near Fort Laramie, moving this way with a gang of 5 or 6. Do you believe he will come here?" "I don't know," Timothy admitted, "but I know I won't run from finding out." Hazel studied his profile in the lamplight spilling through the window, the tight set of his jaw, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. "Vengeance is a heavy thing to carry, Timothy," she said, using his given name for the first time and noticing how he seemed to hear it. "Some things deserve a heavy answer." "Perhaps," she said. "But I have watched what carrying such weight does to a man's shoulders, even when he thinks he stands up straight beneath it." He did not answer that, not directly, but something in his expression softened, and when he rose to leave that night, he took her hand for a moment longer than propriety strictly required, and neither of them pulled away first. The weeks that followed brought spring in earnest, the prairie greening under warmer rains, and Hazel found her days filled not only with her students' lessons, but with the growing, undeniable fact of her feelings for Timothy Wells. He came to town more often than his ranch business strictly demanded, finding reasons to stop by the schoolhouse in the late afternoons, once bringing a crate of books he had ordered from Cheyenne for her students, once simply to walk her to the boarding house when the evening light stretched long and gold across the road. The town noticed, as towns do, and the widow Simmons took to humming while she cooked, which Hazel understood to be a sign of approval. But the peace of that spring was not to last, for the rumors of Silas Crane's approach proved true. It began with a stagecoach robbery some 15 miles east, on the road between Larkspur Creek and the railhead at Cheyenne, in which the driver had been wounded and the passengers stripped of their valuables at gunpoint. Word reached town within a day, carried by a rider who had passed the wreckage, and the description of the gang's leader matched what little Timothy had heard. A tall man with a graying beard and a scar along his jaw, riding a black horse, calling himself by no name at all but answering when pressed to Crane. The town sheriff, a decent but aging man named Averill Pratt, called a meeting at the town hall that same week, and it was there that Hazel first saw the full weight of what Timothy Wells carried settle visibly upon him. He stood near the back of the hall, arms crossed, saying little as Sheriff Pratt outlined what precautions the town might take, until finally someone in the crowd called out, "Wells, you scouted during the war, didn't you? You know this Crane's ways better than any of us." The hall had gone quiet, all eyes turning to Timothy, and Hazel watched him weigh something private before he spoke. "I know his ways," Timothy said. "I've known them a long time." "Then you'll help track him if it comes to that." "If it comes to that," Timothy said, "I'll do more than track him." There was a grim murmur through the crowd at that, half approval and half unease, for the men of Larkspur Creek were not fools, and they had heard enough over the years to guess at old history when they saw it standing in a man's eyes. Hazel felt her stomach tighten with a fear she had not expected, not fear of Silas Crane, whom she had never seen, but fear for Timothy, for what hunting this particular ghost might cost him even if he won. She caught him outside after the meeting broke up, the night air cool and smelling of rain not yet fallen. "Timothy," she said, and he stopped, turning to face her with the lamplight from the hall windows catching the tired lines of his face. "Promise me you will be careful." "I always am." "That is not the same as being safe, and we both know it." He was quiet a moment, studying her the way he sometimes did, as though trying to memorize something he was afraid of losing. "Hazel," he said, using her name plainly, without the formal address he usually kept, "I have spent 13 years wondering what I would do if I ever stood face to face with that man again. I used to think I knew. I used to think I'd shoot him where he stood and feel nothing but relief. And now I have you to come home to," he said, "and I find I am less certain what I want that moment to look like." It was not quite a declaration, not the kind found in the romances Hazel had read as a girl, but it struck her with more force than any of those, for she understood that Timothy Wells did not speak lightly of uncertainty, and that admitting to it to her was itself a kind of gift. "Then let it look like you coming home to me," she said. "Whatever else happens." He had reached out then and touched her cheek, the calloused pad of his thumb tracing lightly along her jaw, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all, the whole prairie night holding its breath around them. "I intend to," he said finally, and it was enough for now to carry them both forward into whatever was coming. What was coming arrived faster than the town expected. 10 days after the meeting, Silas Crane's gang struck the Pemberton Ranch north of town, running off 24 head of cattle and putting a bullet through the shoulder of young Davy Pemberton when he tried to stop them. The boy survived, but the message was clear. Crane was not passing through. He was settling in to plunder the whole valley before moving on, and Larkspur Creek would need to answer him with more than prayers. Sheriff Pratt organized a posse within the week, a dozen men including Timothy Wells, Rafael Ortiz, and several ranchers whose herds had been threatened. Hazel came to see them off at dawn, standing among the small crowd of wives and mothers who had gathered outside the sheriff's office, her shawl pulled tight against the morning chill. "You will come back," she told Timothy, not quite a question. "I will come back," he said, and leaned down from his saddle to press a brief, warm kiss to her forehead, the first such intimacy either had allowed themselves in public, and one that told the gathered townsfolk everything they needed to know about the state of things between the rancher and the schoolteacher. The posse rode out at first light, following the trail of the stolen cattle into the broken country north of the valley, and for 3 days the town waited with the particular tension of a community that had sent its men out to face something dangerous and had no way of knowing how it would end. Hazel taught her lessons those 3 days with only half her mind on the multiplication tables, the other half circling endlessly around thoughts of Timothy somewhere out on the plains, closing in on the man who had haunted him for 13 years. She found herself praying more fervently than she had since her father's death, not for Crane's destruction, exactly, but for Timothy's safe return, and for some measure of peace to finally settle the old wound that had followed him so far from home. On the evening of the 3rd day, the posse returned, tired and travel-worn, leading 3 captured outlaws bound at the wrists, But Silas Crane was not among the prisoners, and the men's faces told a story of near miss and frustration rather than victory. Timothy found Hazel at the schoolhouse just after dusk, his clothes dusty and his eyes hollow with exhaustion. "We had him," he said, before she could even ask. "Cornered his gang in a box canyon 2 days' ride from here. Took 3 of his men, but Crane himself slipped through a gap in the rocks we hadn't scouted. He's wounded, we think, but he's loose, and he knows now that I'm the one leading the hunt." "Then he may come here," Hazel said, looking to strike at you directly. "It's possible. Then I am afraid for you." "Hazel," he took her hands in his, rough and warm despite the chill of the evening. "I need you to understand something. This man is not just some outlaw to me. He has haunted every quiet moment of my life since I was 19 years old. If he comes for me, I intend to finish it one way or another. But I do not intend to let it take me from you. Not now. Not when I've finally found something worth staying alive for." She had wanted to argue, to beg him to let Sheriff Pratt handle it, to insist that vengeance was a poor foundation for any future they might build together, but she saw in his face that the time for such arguments had passed, that the wheel of this old grief was already turning toward its resolution whether either of them wished it or not. So instead she simply held his hands tighter and said, "Then come home to me when it is finished. That is all I ask." "I will," he said. "I swear it." The town settled into a wary vigilance after that, doubling the watch at night, the men keeping their rifles close at hand, the women teaching their children to run for cover at the sound of gunfire. Sheriff Pratt sent word to Cheyenne requesting deputized help, but such requests moved slowly through the territorial government, and Larkspur Creek understood it would likely have to weather this storm largely on its own. The storm broke 8 days later, and it broke, of all places, at the schoolhouse. Hazel had kept her students later than usual that afternoon, helping the older children with a reading exercise, when she heard the sound of horses approaching too fast for comfort. She looked up in time to see 4 riders pull their mounts to a halt outside, and something in the set of their shoulders, the deliberate menace of their approach, told her instantly that these were not townsfolk. "Children," she said, keeping her voice steady with an effort that cost her more than she would ever admit, "I want you to go quietly out the back door and run for your homes. Now, please, quickly." The children, sensing her fear despite her calm tone, obeyed without argument, filing out the small rear door into the field behind the schoolhouse just as the front door was kicked open, and a tall man with a graying beard and a scar along his jaw stepped inside, a revolver held loosely but purposefully in his hand. Hazel had never seen Silas Crane before, but she knew him at once, the way one knows a storm cloud from its color alone. "Schoolteacher," he said, his voice rough as gravel. "You're the one been keeping company with Timothy Wells, ain't you?" She did not answer, willing her voice to remain steady, her mind racing through possibilities even as her body remained still. "I asked you a question," Crane said, taking a step closer, and she saw now the way he favored his left side, the way his coat was stiff with dried blood along one shoulder from the wound the posse had given him days before. "I have kept his company, yes," she said finally, deciding that a lie would serve no purpose here. "What is it you want, Mr. Crane?" Something flickered across his weathered face at the sound of his own name, surprise perhaps, or something closer to bitter amusement. "Smart girl," he said. "What I want is simple enough. I want Wells to know what it feels like to lose something he can't get back. Been feeling that way myself, more years than I care to count." "Taking me will not bring you whatever peace you are looking for," Hazel said, though her heart pounded with a fear she fought to keep from her voice. "Maybe not," Crane admitted. "But it'll bring him to me, and that's all I need." He gestured with the revolver toward the door, and Hazel, seeing no other choice that would not risk immediate violence, allowed herself to be led outside, where his 3 remaining men waited with the horses. She was lifted, not gently but not with deliberate cruelty either, onto the back of a spare mount, her wrists bound loosely enough that she understood Crane wanted her alive and largely unharmed, at least for now, as leverage rather than as a victim. They rode north out of town, toward the broken hills where Timothy's posse had nearly cornered Crane before, and Hazel forced herself to memorize every landmark they passed, every turn in the trail, every distinctive rock formation, in case the knowledge might later prove useful. Word reached Timothy Wells within the hour, carried by one of Hazel's students who had run the entire mile to the Wells ranch on legs shaking with fear and exertion, gasping out the story of the riders and the schoolteacher taken at gunpoint. Timothy had gone white at the news, then had moved with a speed and precision that Rafael Ortiz later described to Sheriff Pratt as something closer to a man possessed than a man simply afraid. "Saddle the horses," Timothy said. "All of them. We ride within 10 minutes. "Timothy," Raphael said, catching his employer's arm as he checked the loads in his rifle with hands that trembled only slightly, "you cannot ride into this like a man seeking his own death. She will need you thinking clear, not thinking only of revenge." Timothy had stopped then, forcing himself to breathe, forcing the roar of fear and fury in his chest to settle into something he could use rather than something that would use him. "You're right," he said finally. "You're right, Raphael. I need my head, not just my anger." They rode within the 10 minutes regardless. Timothy, Raphael, Bill Cody, and Sheriff Pratt with 2 of his deputized townsmen, following the trail north that Hazel had memorized, though of course they could not know that yet, tracking the sign of 6 horses moving fast toward the broken country. Hazel, meanwhile, found herself seated by a small fire as dusk settled over the hills, watching Silas Crane with a wary curiosity that had begun to overtake her fear. He was not what she had expected, not the mindless brute the town's rumors had painted him as. There was intelligence in his eyes, and something else too, a weariness that seemed to run bone deep, the exhaustion of a man who had been running from something for so long he had forgotten what it felt like to stop. "You are not afraid of me," Crane observed, settling across the fire from her with a grimace as his wounded shoulder protested the movement. "I am afraid," Hazel said honestly. "But I have found that fear serves better when examined than when simply endured." Crane made a sound that might have been a laugh, rough and rusty from disuse. "Wells found himself a philosopher," he said. "Didn't expect that." "You know him well, then, beyond what happened during the war." Something shifted in Crane's expression, the bitter amusement fading into something more complicated. "I know what I took from him," he said quietly. "Been running from that knowledge near 14 years now. Funny thing about running, though, man gets tired eventually, even a man like me. Then why continue this? Why take me? Why draw him here if you are tired of running?" Crane stared into the fire for a long moment before answering. "Because I don't know how to stop," he said. "Been a raider, then an outlaw, so long I've near forgot how to be anything else. But I'll tell you something, schoolteacher, since you asked so plain. I had a boy once. Younger than Wells's brother was when he stopped himself, jaw tightening. When that happened. Boy's grown now, somewhere back east, doesn't know his father from a hole in the ground, and that's for the best, given what his father turned into. But I think on him some nights. Wonder what he'd make of me if he knew." Hazel studied the outlaw's weathered face in the firelight and felt something she had not expected to feel toward this man, a flicker of pity, unwelcome but undeniable. "It is never too late to become something other than what you have been, Mr. Crane," she said softly. "Might be true for some men," Crane said. "Don't know that it's true for me. Not anymore. Not after everything." He looked up, meeting her eyes across the flames. "But I'll tell you this much, since we're being honest. I didn't ride out here just for revenge on Wells. Been shot twice this month, losing blood I can't spare, and I know how this ends, girl, whether it's tonight or next month or next year. I mean for it to end here one way with him. Figured if I'm going down, I'd rather it be at the hands of the one man in this territory who has earned the right to put me down." Hazel felt a chill at those words, understanding suddenly that she had been brought not merely as leverage but as witness, that Silas Crane had orchestrated his own ending and meant for Timothy Wells to be its instrument. "That is a heavy thing to ask of him," she said. "Reckon it is," Crane agreed. But some debts only get paid one way. They did not have long to wait. Timothy and the posse found the camp just past midnight, guided by the glow of the fire and the sound of restless horses. And what followed happened with the swift, terrible clarity that violence often carries in its final moments. Crane's remaining men, seeing themselves outnumbered and outgunned, surrendered with little resistance once Sheriff Pratt's deputies had them covered from two directions. But Crane himself rose from the fire as Timothy approached on foot, rifle lowered but ready, and the two men stood facing each other across the flickering light with 14 years of history stretched taut between them. "Wells," Crane said. "Crane." Timothy's voice was steady, though Hazel, watching from where she sat bound but unharmed near the fire, could see the tremor in his hands, could see the effort it cost him to hold himself in check. "You've got her back safe," Crane said. "That's all I meant to ensure. Wasn't going to hurt her. Needed you to come, that's all. You could have sent word instead of taking her at gunpoint. Would you have come if I'd sent word?" Timothy did not answer that, and the silence stretched long enough that Hazel understood the truth of it. He would have come regardless, word or no word, gunpoint or none. "I owe you a debt," Crane said finally, "that I can't pay back. Elias was 16 years old, and I let my men shoot him down over a mare not worth the powder it took to kill him. I've told myself 1,000 stories since then about why it happened, about the war, about desperation, about men doing terrible things in terrible times. None of them make it right. None of them give you your brother back." "No," Timothy said, his voice rough now, the careful control cracking at the edges. "They don't." "I'm not asking forgiveness," Crane said. "Don't reckon I've earned the right to ask for that. But I am asking you to finish this. I'm shot up bad, Wells, been bleeding since the canyon, and I mean to end this tonight, one way or another. Rather it be by your hand than by fever in some ditch, alone, same as the coward I've been for 14 years. Hazel watched Timothy's face in the firelight, watched the war being fought behind his eyes between the boy who had lost his brother and the man who had built a life since, who had found something worth protecting in her, who had promised her he would come home. "I am not going to murder an unarmed man," Timothy said finally. "Wasn't asking for murder." Crane's hand moved, slow and deliberate, toward the revolver at his hip, and Hazel felt her breath catch in her throat, understanding in that instant what Crane intended, that he meant to force the confrontation, to draw against Timothy and give the younger man no choice but to defend himself. "Crane, don't," Timothy said, his rifle coming up despite himself, some instinct honed by years of danger overriding his conscious will. But Crane's hand had already closed around the grip of his revolver, and the moment stretched into something eternal and terrible. And then the gun cleared its holster and Timothy fired, the shot cracking loud across the silent hills, and Silas Crane fell backward into the dirt beside the fire he had built for what he must have known would be the last night of his life. Hazel screamed, though she could not later remember doing so, and Timothy was at her side in a moment, cutting her bonds with shaking hands, checking her for injury with an urgency that spoke of the fear he had carried the entire ride north. But even as he held her, even as she felt the solid, living warmth of him against the terror of what had just happened, she saw him glance back toward the fallen man, toward the outlaw who had haunted half his life, and she saw something complicated move across his features, something that was not triumph, not even relief, but a strange, heavy grief that seemed to catch him entirely by surprise. Crane was not yet dead. The shot had taken him low in the chest, and he lay gasping in the dirt, his eyes finding Timothy's across the small distance between them. "Wells," he managed, blood bubbling faintly at the corner of his mouth. "In my coat. Inside pocket." Timothy hesitated only a moment before crossing to kneel beside the dying man, reaching carefully into the indicated pocket and withdrawing a small, worn photograph and a folded letter, edges soft with age and handling. "My boy," Crane said, each word costing him visible effort now. "Name's Thomas. Lives with his mother's people in Ohio. Never told him what became of me. If you'd see that letter reaches him, tell him. Tell him his father was a soldier once before he was anything else. Before all this, I'll see it done, Timothy said, and Hazel, watching, understood that something had shifted in him, some old certainty giving way to a more complicated truth. One more thing, Crane whispered, his breathing growing shallow now, the light already beginning to fade from his eyes. Bury me proper, Wells, if you've got it in you, not in some unmarked ditch like the man I've been. Bury me like the soldier I was before the war made monsters of us both. Timothy's jaw tightened, old anger and something newer, something almost like understanding, warring visibly across his face. You don't have the right to ask that of me. No, Crane agreed, his voice barely a breath now. Reckon I don't, asking anyway. He did not speak again. Within a few minutes, under the wide, cold stars of the Wyoming hills, Silas Crane died, and Timothy Wells knelt beside him for a long moment afterward, utterly still, while Sheriff Pratt and the others secured the surrendered outlaws and Hazel stood watching, uncertain what to say to a man confronting the death of his oldest wound. They rode back to Larkspur Creek in the gray hours before dawn, Crane's body wrapped and carried across a spare horse. The three surrendered outlaws bound and marched ahead under guard. Hazel rode beside Timothy in silence for most of the journey, sensing that words would not serve him yet, that whatever was happening within him needed room to settle before it could be spoken aloud. It was only as the town came into view, the schoolhouse roof catching the first light of morning, that Timothy finally spoke. I keep waiting to feel relieved, he said quietly. 13 years of wanting this man dead, and now that it's done, I feel nothing like what I expected. Grief rarely arrives on schedule, Hazel said, or in the shape we expect it to take. He asked me to bury him with honors, Hazel, like a soldier, after everything he did. What do you intend to do? Timothy was quiet a long moment, his eyes fixed on the horizon, and when he finally answered, his voice carried a certainty that surprised them both. I intend to do it, he said. God help me, I intend to do exactly what he asked. Hazel did not argue, though she suspected correctly that the town would have a great deal to say on the matter once word got out. She was right. The news of Crane's death spread through Larkspur Creek within hours of the posse's return, greeted with the kind of relief that comes when a long threat is finally lifted. But the relief curdled quickly into confusion, and then outrage, once Timothy Wells made known his intention to bury Silas Crane, not in the pauper's field behind the church, but in the town's cemetery proper, with a wooden marker, a folded flag draped over the coffin in recognition of the man's Confederate service during the war, and a rifle volley fired in salute at the graveside. The town council met that same evening in an emergency session, packed tight into the small meeting hall with a crowd of townsfolk who had come to voice their objections in person. This man murdered my nephew's boy not 2 months back, shouted one rancher, a broad man named Otis Fenwick, whose family had lost cattle and blood both to Crane's raids. Robbed half this valley blind, and you mean to bury him like a hero? I do not mean to bury him like a hero, Timothy said, standing at the front of the hall, his hat in his hands, his voice steady despite the hostility radiating from the crowd. I mean to bury him like a man who fought honorably once, long before he became what he became. I mean to bury him with the dignity that was denied my own brother when Crane's men left him in a shallow grave without a marker, without a prayer, without so much as a moment's respect. That's exactly why he don't deserve better than what he gave your brother, Fenwick shot back, drawing a murmur of agreement from several in the crowd. Maybe he doesn't deserve it, Timothy said. I've thought long on that these past 2 days, and I confess I don't have a clean answer. But I've decided this isn't only about what Crane deserves. It's about what kind of man I choose to be, standing over his grave. My brother died at 19, bleeding into the dirt of a farm he never got to grow old on, and I spent 13 years letting that death poison every quiet moment I had. I watched what carrying that hate did to my father, who died a bitter, broken man before his time. I won't carry it the same way. I won't let Silas Crane's evil be the last word between us. I intend to bury him properly and be done with it, and if that makes me a fool in this town's eyes, then I reckon I can live with being a fool." The hall had gone quiet at that, the anger in the room not entirely dissipated but tempered now by something more complicated, a grudging respect perhaps, or simply an unwillingness to argue further with a man who had just risked his life to bring the schoolteacher home safely. Sheriff Pratt, standing near the front, cleared his throat. "It's Wells's right, far as the law's concerned," he said. "Man's buried where his kin or his community sees fit, and seeing as Crane's got no kin here, and the town don't want the trouble of it, I don't see the harm in letting Wells handle it his own way, provided he does it quiet and doesn't ask the town to pay for it." "I don't ask the town for anything," Timothy said. "Only the ground and a moment's peace to see it done." The council granted it, more from exhaustion than agreement, and the matter was settled, though the muttering did not stop, not that night nor in the days that followed. Hazel found Timothy at his ranch 2 evenings later, sitting alone on the porch steps in the fading light, Crane's photograph and letter resting on his knee. "You are building a coffin yourself," she observed, noting the fresh-cut lumber stacked near the barn. "Didn't seem right to ask anyone else to do it," he said. "Figured this much, at least, ought to be my own labor." She sat beside him on the step, close enough that their shoulders touched, and for a while neither of them spoke, watching the sun sink behind the distant mountains in a wash of orange and violet. "The town thinks you have lost your senses," she said finally. "I know it. For what it is worth," she said, "I do not think you have. I think you have found something most men never manage to find, even in a whole lifetime of trying." He turned to look at her, his expression uncertain, hungry for the reassurance even as he seemed almost afraid to accept it. "What is that?" "A way to set down a weight you have carried since you were 19 years old," she said. "You buried your brother once without ceremony, without the dignity he deserved, because the war made such things impossible. You cannot undo that, but you can choose now what kind of man stands at a grave, and I think that choice matters more than what the town believes about your reasons. Even if my reasons look like madness to everyone else. Even then," she said, "perhaps especially then, the bravest things rarely look sensible from the outside, Timothy. I have found that to be true of most things worth doing." He reached for her hand, and she let him take it, their fingers lacing together in the gathering dusk. "I keep thinking about what he said," Timothy admitted. "About being a soldier before he was anything else. I hated hearing it, hated that he tried to claim some sliver of decency for himself after everything. But I couldn't stop thinking that maybe the same is true for most men who do terrible things. Maybe the war broke something in him same as it nearly broke something in me, and the only difference between us is that I had you to help me set the pieces back together, and he never did." "You do not excuse what he did," Hazel said carefully. "No," Timothy agreed. "I don't excuse it. I don't forgive it, not really, not yet, maybe not ever fully. But I find I can bury the man without either excusing or forgiving him, if that makes any sense at all. I can give him the ground and the flag and the volley, not for his sake, but for mine, so that when I stand at that grave, I know I chose mercy over hatred, even for a man who gave me every reason in the world to choose otherwise." Hazel leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath his shirt, and thought that she had never admired anyone more in her life than she admired Timothy Wells in that moment, sitting on his porch steps with a dead man's letter on his knee, choosing, against every instinct of grief and anger, to be gentle. The burial took place 3 days later, on a bright, wind-swept morning that seemed almost too beautiful for the occasion. Timothy had built the coffin himself, plain but sturdy, and had dug the grave alongside Raphael Ortiz and Bill Cody in a quiet corner of the town cemetery, away from the family plots but within the consecrated ground nonetheless. The town minister, Reverend Aldous Fry, had initially refused to officiate, citing the outrage of his congregation, but had relented after a long private conversation with Timothy in which, according to the little the Reverend later shared, Timothy had spoken of forgiveness not as an erasure of wrong but as a discipline of the soul, something he had learned in Scripture and relearned, painfully, in his own life. "I do not stand here today to honor what this man did," Reverend Fry told the small gathering at the graveside, which consisted of Timothy, Hazel, Raphael, Bill Cody, Sheriff Pratt, and somewhat to everyone's surprise Otis Fenwick, who had come despite his earlier objections, standing at the back with his hat in his hands and his jaw set tight. "I stand here to honor the courage of the man who chooses to bury him with dignity regardless. There is a scripture that speaks of loving one's enemies, and I confess I have found that commandment easier to preach than to practice. But I have watched Timothy Wells practice it these past days with more sincerity than I have managed in years of Sunday sermons, and I find myself humbled by the lesson." Timothy stepped forward then, the folded flag in his hands, a relic he had kept since the war, worn but carefully preserved, and laid it across the plain wooden coffin. He said nothing for a long moment, simply standing with his hand resting on the flag, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried clear across the windswept cemetery. "Silas Crane took my brother from me 13 years ago, and for a long time I believed the only honest response to that loss was hatred, carried forward until either he or I was dead. I was nearly right about that, but somewhere along the way I found something worth more than hatred, something that taught me a man can hold on to grief without letting it curdle into poison. I bury Silas Crane today not because he deserves honor, but because I have decided that I do not wish to be a man defined by what my enemies deserve. I wish to be a man defined by what I choose to give, even when it costs me something to give it." He nodded to Raphael and Bill Cody, who lifted their rifles and fired the salute, 3 shots cracking sharp across the quiet morning, and then, together, the small group lowered the coffin into the ground, and Timothy Wells knelt beside the grave and pressed his palm to the raw earth, exactly as he had done in the story's opening, exactly as Hazel had watched him do while the town whispered and questioned his sanity. But standing there now, having lived through the days leading to that moment, Hazel understood what the rest of the town had not yet grasped, that Timothy Wells had not lost his mind at all. He had found something far rarer than sanity as the world commonly measured it. He had found peace. The weeks following the burial were not easy ones for Timothy Wells, whatever peace he had found notwithstanding. The town's disapproval did not vanish overnight, and there were those who continued to mutter about the rancher who had buried an outlaw with military honors, who avoided his company at the mercantile or crossed the street rather than tip their hats to him as they once had. Otis Fenwick, for his part, never fully came around to approval, though he did stop voicing his objections openly after that morning at the cemetery, and eventually, months later, even brought Timothy a length of good rope as a wordless gesture of something like reconciliation, which Timothy accepted with equal wordlessness and a firm handshake. Hazel found herself defending Timothy's choice more than once in those weeks, in conversations at the schoolhouse gate, in the aisles of the mercantile, even once from the pulpit-adjacent gossip of the sewing circle that met at the widow Simmons's boarding house on Thursday afternoons. "I do not understand how you can defend such a thing," said Mrs. Otis Fenwick, the rancher's wife, one Thursday, her needle pausing over her embroidery. "That man terrorized this valley for weeks, shot young Davy Pemberton clean through the shoulder." "I do not defend what Silas Crane did," Hazel said carefully, choosing her words with the same precision she used when explaining a difficult lesson to her students. "I defend Timothy's right to answer cruelty with mercy rather than more cruelty. There is a difference, I think, between excusing evil and refusing to let it turn you into something you would not otherwise choose to be." "Sounds like fancy words for foolishness," Mrs. Fenwick said, though with less heat than before. "Perhaps," Hazel allowed. "But I have found, in my short time in this town, that the things which sound most foolish are sometimes the things that require the most courage. The sewing circle had not been fully convinced that afternoon, but Hazel noticed, in the weeks that followed, a gradual softening in the town's collective attitude, helped along by small things. Timothy's continued generosity toward families still recovering from Crane's raids, his quiet insistence on paying for young Davy Pemberton's medical care out of his own pocket, his steady presence at church each Sunday despite the occasional cool reception. The town did not forget what he had done, nor did it entirely approve, but it began slowly to make peace with the fact that Timothy Wells was, whatever his eccentricities, a fundamentally decent man, and decency, in a frontier town that had seen more than its share of hardship, counted for a great deal in the end. It was on a warm evening in early June, some 6 weeks after the burial, that Timothy asked Hazel to walk with him along the creek that gave the town its name, the water running high and clear from the spring melt, the cottonwoods along its banks thick with new leaves. "I have been thinking," he said as they walked, "about the letter Crane asked me to send to his son Thomas in Ohio. Have you sent it?" "I have, along with a letter of my own explaining what I could of the circumstances, though I confess I did not know how to make sense of the man for a stranger when I still struggled to make sense of him myself." He paused at a bend in the creek, watching the water tumble over a scattering of smooth stones. "I received a reply 3 days past, from Thomas himself. He is 19 years old now, working as a clerk in a shipping office in Cincinnati. He wrote to thank me, said he had wondered his whole life what became of his father, and that even the hard truth of it was better than the not knowing. Said he was grateful his father had been buried with some dignity, whatever else was true of him." "That must have meant a great deal to you," Hazel said softly. "It did," Timothy admitted. "More than I expected. I think I needed to hear that someone else understood why I did what I did, beyond just you and the Reverend." "I have always understood," Hazel said. "I know," he said, and turned to face her fully, the creek murmuring beside them, the evening light turning the water to molten gold. "Hazel, I have been trying to find the right moment to say this for weeks now, and I confess I do not think there is ever going to be a moment that feels entirely right, given everything that has happened. So I am simply going to say it now, standing here, and hope that the saying of it is enough." Her heart had begun to race, some instinct telling her what was coming even before he continued. "I have loved you," he said, "since the day I found you stranded on the road with a broken wagon wheel, though it took me longer than it should have to admit as much, even to myself. I have watched you stand beside me through the hardest thing I have faced in 13 years, watched you defend a choice that half this town still thinks marks me as a madman, and I have never once doubted, not for a single moment, that you understood me better than anyone else alive. I do not have much to offer you beyond a modest ranch and a herd of cattle and a heart that has been mended, I think, largely because of you. But I am asking, all the same, if you would consider becoming my wife." Hazel felt tears gathering, unbidden and unstoppable, and found herself laughing softly even as they fell, a laugh born of joy too large to contain any other way. "Timothy Wells," she said, "I have been waiting for you to ask that question since somewhere around the 3rd time you rescued me, though I confess I lost count of exactly when that certainty settled in. Is that a yes?" "That is most certainly a yes." He kissed her then, there beside the creek with the cottonwoods rustling overhead and the last light of evening turning everything gold. And it was a kiss that carried in it all the weeks of careful courtship, all the fear and grief and hard-won peace of the preceding months, all the promise of a future neither of them had quite dared to imagine when a broken wagon wheel had first brought them together. They were married on the 15th of July in the small church at Larkspur Creek, with Reverend Fry officiating and half the town in attendance, including, somewhat to Hazel's quiet satisfaction, Otis and Mrs. Fenwick, who had by then made a fuller peace with Timothy Wells than either had expected to make. The widow Simmons cried through the entire ceremony, and Raphael Ortiz stood as Timothy's best man, and Hazel's students, all 23 of them, scattered wildflowers along the church aisle in a gesture that left several of the older women dabbing at their eyes. Hazel wore a dress of pale blue muslin, sewn by her own hand with help from the sewing circle that had once questioned her defense of Timothy's choices and had since become something closer to friends. And when she walked down the aisle toward the man waiting for her at the altar, she felt none of the uncertainty that had once shadowed her arrival in this town, only a deep and settled certainty that she had found exactly where she belonged. "Do you, Timothy Wells, take this woman to be your lawful wife?" Reverend Fry asked. "I do," Timothy said, his voice steady and clear, his eyes never leaving Hazel's face. "And do you, Hazel Hadley, take this man to be your lawful husband?" "I do," Hazel said, and meant it with every part of her being. They settled into the rhythms of ranch life together in the months that followed, Hazel continuing to teach at the schoolhouse through the following year, until the arrival of their first child made the daily walk into town increasingly impractical, at which point she trained a young woman named Sarah Whitfield to take over the schoolroom, while Hazel focused her energies on the growing household at the Wells Ranch. Their first child, a son they named Elias after Timothy's brother, was born in the spring of 1879, a robust, red-faced infant who announced his arrival with lungs powerful enough to be heard clear to the barn, according to Raphael Ortiz, who had been pacing outside the ranch house the entire duration of Hazel's labor. Timothy had wept, unashamed, when the midwife placed the child in his arms, and had spent the better part of that first night simply sitting beside the cradle, watching his son sleep, as though needing to reassure himself that this small, living proof of love and continuance was truly real. "He has your look about him already," Hazel said, watching her husband from the bed, exhaustion and joy mingling in equal measure. "God help him," Timothy said, though the words carried nothing but tenderness. "I hope he inherits your sense at least, along with whatever he takes from me." "He will have plenty of both," Hazel said. "We will make certain of it." 2 years later came a daughter, whom they named Ruth after Hazel's mother, a quieter child than her brother but possessed of the same steady gray eyes as her father. And 3 years after that, a second son, William, named for Bill Cody, who by then had become less an employee of the ranch than an honorary member of the family, having stood as godfather to both older children and shown no sign of wishing to seek his fortune elsewhere. The ranch prospered in those years, Timothy's careful management and Raphael's steady hand with the herds building the operation into one of the more substantial spreads in the valley, and Larkspur Creek itself grew alongside it. The town swelling to nearly 1,000 residents by the mid-1880s, as the railroad extended its reach further into the territory, and brought new settlers west in search of the same fresh starts that had once brought Hazel Hadley riding into town on the back of a stranger's horse. The grave of Sela's crane remained in the town cemetery throughout those years, its wooden marker eventually replaced by a simple stone that Timothy commissioned himself, bearing only the man's name and the years of his birth and death, with no further inscription beyond a single line that Timothy had chosen after long deliberation. He served and was forgiven. Some in town still found the marker's presence uncomfortable, a reminder of violence they would rather forget, but most, as the years passed and the raw grief of Crane's crimes faded into the more distant territory of history, came to regard it simply as a curious feature of the cemetery, a story told and retold to newcomers as an example of the strange, stubborn mercy of Timothy Wells, the rancher who had once buried his enemy with full honors and been thought mad for it, only to be proven, in the fullness of time, to have been wiser than most of his neighbors ever gave him credit for. Thomas Crane, the outlaw's son, visited Larkspur Creek once, in the summer of 1885, having saved for years to make the journey west and see for himself the grave of the father he had never truly known. He was a grown man by then, married with a child of his own, working as a bookkeeper in Cincinnati, and he arrived at the Wells Ranch with a letter of introduction and a nervousness that Hazel found immediately endearing. "I did not know if I would be welcome," he admitted, standing on the porch where Timothy and Hazel had once shared their first quiet conversations about grief and forgiveness. "Given everything my father did to your family, Mr. Wells." "You are not your father," Timothy said simply, extending his hand. "And you are welcome here, Thomas, for as long as you care to stay." Thomas Crane stayed 3 days, visiting the grave each morning, sitting with it in a silence that Timothy respected without intruding upon, and on his final evening before departing for the long journey back east, he sat with Timothy and Hazel on the porch and asked the question that had clearly brought him west in the first place. "Why did you bury him with honors?" he asked. "After everything he did to your family. I have read the newspaper accounts, Mr. Wells. I know what my father was." Timothy considered the question for a long moment, watching the sunset paint the western sky in the same colors it had painted the evening he proposed to Hazel by the creek. "Because hatred is a debt that only grows larger the longer you carry it," he said finally. "I could have buried your father in an unmarked grave and told myself it was justice. Perhaps, by some measure, it would have been. But I had a choice in that moment, Thomas. A choice about what kind of man I wanted to be for the rest of my life. And I chose mercy, not because your father deserved it, but because I did not want to spend the remainder of my days as a man ruled by hate. I have never regretted that choice, not once in all the years since." Thomas Crane had wept then quietly, and Hazel had reached over to take his hand, understanding in that moment that this young man had carried his own version of Timothy's old grief, the weight of an absent, terrible father, and that perhaps this visit, this conversation, had given him something of the same peace that Timothy himself had found beside a fire in the hills 14 years before. "Thank you," Thomas said finally, "for giving him that dignity, and for helping me understand at last that he was not only the man the newspapers described. He was many things," Timothy agreed. "A soldier, a father, a man who lost his way. I do not think any of us are only one thing, Thomas. I try to remember that, especially on the days when it would be easier to forget." The years continued to unfold gently after that, marked by the ordinary joys and small sorrows of a life well lived. Hazel and Timothy welcomed a 4th child, another daughter, in 1888, whom they named Grace, and watched their older children grow into capable young adults. Elias showing an early aptitude for ranch management that promised well for the eventual inheritance of his father's herds. Ruth developing into a young woman with her mother's love of books and her father's quiet steadiness. William proving himself, even as a boy, to be the peacemaker among his siblings. Always the one to smooth over squabbles with a fairness that seemed almost too mature for his years. Larkspur Creek itself continued to grow and change around them, the town eventually incorporating properly as the county seat, gaining a proper courthouse and a second church, and eventually a small hospital that Hazel herself had lobbied tirelessly for after watching too many families suffer for want of proper medical care. The schoolhouse where she had once taught expanded into a 2-room building capable of serving the town's growing population of children, and though Hazel no longer taught there herself, she remained on the school board for decades, shaping the education of 2 full generations of Larkspur Creek children. Timothy, for his part, was eventually elected to the town council, a fact that struck him with no small irony given how thoroughly the same council had once questioned his sanity over the matter of Silas Crane's burial. He served with the same quiet integrity that had defined him since the day Hazel first met him on that muddy road, and though he never spoke often of the events of that spring in 1878, he never hid from them either, understanding that the story of the outlaw he had buried with honors had become, in its own strange way, a part of the town's identity, a reminder passed down through the years that mercy, however difficult, however incomprehensible it might seem in the moment, was rarely a mistake in the long accounting of a life. On the evening of their 20th wedding anniversary, in the summer of 1898, Timothy and Hazel walked once more along the creek where he had first proposed, older now, gray touching both their heads, but no less in love than they had been on that golden evening 2 decades before. "Do you ever regret it?" Hazel asked him as they walked, the same question she had asked in different forms many times over the years. "Burying him the way you did, facing the town's judgment for it." Timothy considered the question with the same care he always gave it, though his answer by now had long since settled into certainty. "Never," he said, "not for one single day." "That choice taught me who I wanted to be, Hazel, and everything good that has come since. This life, these children, you, standing here beside me after 20 years, all of it traces back to that decision, in some fashion. I do not think I could have become the man capable of loving you as I do if I had not first learned to lay down that old hatred beside Crane's grave." Hazel leaned her head against his shoulder, exactly as she had done that first evening on his porch so many years before, and felt the same deep, settled contentment she had felt then, only deepened now by 2 decades of shared life, shared grief, shared joy, and the steady accumulation of a love that had proven, against every expectation the town once held, to be the sanest choice either of them had ever made. "The town no longer questions your sanity," she observed, smiling. "No," Timothy agreed, smiling back at her, the same almost smile that had first caught her attention on a muddy road so many years ago, though it came easier to him now, worn smooth by 2 decades of happiness. "I suppose they have finally decided I knew what I was doing all along. I knew it from the beginning," Hazel said. "You always did have more sense than the rest of this town combined," Timothy said, and kissed her softly as the creek murmured on beside them, carrying the last light of evening westward toward the mountains, toward the wide, waiting future that still stretched ahead of them, full of grandchildren not yet born, of harvests not yet gathered, of all the ordinary, extraordinary days that a long and well-loved life still had left to give. They walked home together in the gathering dusk, hand in hand, past the cemetery where a simple stone still marked the grave of a man who had once been an enemy and had become, through one rancher's stubborn insistence on mercy, something closer to a lesson the whole town had learned to carry forward, that the hardest choices were often the ones most worth making, and that love, given the chance, could grow even from the unlikeliest and most difficult soil. And so it was that Timothy Wells and Hazel Hadley, who had once been strangers on a muddy road in the spring of 1878, lived out the remainder of their days together in Larkspur Creek, surrounded by children and grandchildren, respected by a town that had once questioned the rancher's sanity, and had long since come to understand the wisdom hidden within his mercy. Their love story remembered not only for its romance, but for the quiet, radical grace at its center. A grace that had turned an act of scandal into a legacy, and a story of vengeance into, at last, a story of love.